I say this very, very hesitantly, but I think JD Vance might be scarier than Donald Trump. Very hesitantly, because Trump is obviously very scary. But do you not feel a bit sometimes with Donald Trump that, like Boris Johnson, if he thought that power, prestige and success would be delivered by adopting an entirely different... Well, actually, no, JD Vance fits into that category as well, doesn't he? But some of the stuff that he's come out with is more explicitly offensive than some of the stuff that or are they just peas in a pod? Are they just... We are effectively running this country by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. So, you know, where Islamophobia rears its ugly head, misogyny is never far behind, a point that Ben in Brighton made. But that analysis from the American broadcaster Chris Hayes is something that I am enduringly fascinated by. As you know, what happens online to people who we once respected and in some cases still love. I think we did our best work together, as in you and me. I think we did our best work together during COVID, during the anti-vaccine conspiracies that grew up and the fractures that this kind of online self-radicalization delivered to the heart of relationships and families. I'll always remember speaking, it was usually to wives and girlfriends, but it was sometimes to husbands and boyfriends or siblings about the rabbit holes down which their loved ones had fallen and the absolute crackpot nature of the stuff that they believed. It's the closest I've ever come to the rabbit hole. Because I was getting messages, I told you at the time, from people that I hadn't been in touch with in some cases for 30 or 40 years, one of them. Just messaged me on Facebook to say, you're the only journalist I know. Can you just tell me whether or not there's any truth in this? And it was something about 5G phone masts spreading the virus. Do you remember that? The stuff that people... And what's mad about the people who believed that, it's none of us really found the right way to talk them down. We never really got our heads around how to talk them down. And I make no bones about the fact, I think that an awful lot of the support for people like Donald Trump and JD Vance is a consequence of exactly the same thing. You can believe that about 5G phone masts, then you can believe that about Sadiq Khan or about the United Kingdom or about London. And that's not mad online baiting. You know, the phrase Londonistan, I think was coined by Melanie Phillips, who still writes a column in the Times. These people believe the stuff that they pump out. And therefore, when it gets embellished and exaggerated and magnified and manipulated and lands in the inbox of a 75-year-old man in Florida, he is going to believe it too. And I don't know how you talk them down. But what we haven't seen before, and this is why I find JD Vance so interesting, what we haven't seen before is that boiled brain achieve. Well, we've seen it a bit in this country, probably with Liz Truss, probably with Andrew Bridgen, remember him? Possibly with Nadine Dorries. We've seen some evidence of boiled brain syndrome in British politics, but to see it at and I don't think Trump has a boiled brain. This is why I find Chris Hayes' words so interesting. He talks about an ideological transformation and separates the opportunism from the self-radicalization. I think he, writes Chris Hayes, and huge swathes of the modern right really have self-radicalized, largely online, and are constantly imbibing all kinds of genuinely monstrous, insane, and bizarre ideas, and have come to believe them. So JD Vance then becomes someone who isn't spewing bilge to a loving audience. He is sharing his boiled brain convictions about what the United Kingdom is like. That's how you end up in a place where you can be lectured by someone who's never visited your town on what your town is really like. And the reason why you can't admit it is because you're not allowed to say so. I guess it probably depends a little bit on how much time you spend online. So there are two questions here, but I think you can probably distill them down to one. If you set aside, if you both accept and set aside the opportunism, if you say, yes, there is clearly opportunism here, and it's hard to separate where the opportunism begins and where the ideological transformation ends, how can one man in 8 years go from calling Donald Trump America's Hitler to becoming Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate. Just pause for a minute and think about that. In the space of 8 years, to go from calling him America's Hitler, which was quite an early move, actually. It was before he became president, JD Vance was sharing that opinion. And then, of course, it hardened up as a prediction, as a description, throughout his presidency, culminating in January the 6th, which is about as close to the fascist playbook as any leader of a Western liberal democracy has ever come, in countries that stayed Western liberal democracies, as opposed to ones that actually fell to that kind of ideology. So the support for his description increased during the course of Donald Trump's presidency, but JD Vance retreated so swiftly and so violently from his position, from the idea that Donald Trump was America's Hitler, his words, not mine, that he has now accepted the nomination to be his running mate. I mean, do you want to have a crack at explaining that? I don't know that you'll do a better job than Chris Hayes, but I'd love you to try. He writes, a big part of modern right-wing culture is the frisson of the illicit, the reading of this or that writer or account who are outre in whatever ways. You know, it's like a sort of sick thrill you get from reading fascism, or reading race IQ obsession, or reading Holocaust denial adjacency, or even sort of weird sexual fixations and pathologies, he writes. And a lot of them, Chris Hayes suggests, have simply pickled their brains. So how does it work? How do you go from considering Donald Trump to be America's Hitler to accepting his invitation to be his running mate in a presidential election? 0345 6060 973. A couple of callers still waiting, I think, to talk about the first Islamist country with nukes comment that JD Vance made. If you're just joining us, you might be a little surprised to learn which country he was referring to when he deployed that rather strange language. He was referring to Britain. He was referring to the United Kingdom. And on the Hitler thing, good Lord, there's a phrase. On the Hitler thing, I guess you have to contemplate the possibility that he's gone from going, God, he's America's Hitler, to, yes, he's America's Hitler. You have to contemplate that possibility. The transformation has happened inside him, as opposed to in his perceptions of Trump, or indeed inside Trump.